Polish Stories, podcaście dla cudzoziemców i cudzoziemek uczących się języka polskiego. Jeśli kochasz książki, filmy, seriale telewizyjne i opowieści o ciekawych ludziach, zapraszam. To miejsce jest właśnie dla Ciebie. Odcinek 17. Marissa opowiada o językach odziedziczonych. Dzisiaj zapraszam do wysłuchania pierwszej rozmowy w historii podcastu Polish Stories. Moją gościnią jest Marissa, Polka i Amerykanka, autorka kanału na YouTubie Relearn a Language, jak również strony internetowej pełnej informacji i pomocnych artykułów dla osób uczących się języka odziedziczonego, nie tylko polskiego. Linki znajdziesz oczywiście w opisie odcinka. Dzisiejsza rozmowa będzie po angielsku i w jej trakcie wyjaśnimy dlaczego. Zapraszam serdecznie, zwłaszcza jeśli język polski jest językiem Twoich przodków i dlatego się nim interesujesz, ale również jeśli uczysz się polskiego z zupełnie innych powodów i chcesz się dowiedzieć, jak to jest z tymi językami obcymi i odziedziczonymi. Hi Marissa, very nice to see you again. Can you tell us a bit of why you are a guest in Polish Stories? We're going to speak in English because this is your preferred choice. But there is a reason why you are on a podcast about Polish language.
Yes, thank you for having me. And thank you for being accommodating with the English. And I'm sure we'll talk about that. But yeah, I was invited on to talk about relearning my native language, which is Polish.
Yeah, it is. So how is it? How does it happen? Obviously, you sound American. I think everyone knows that you are American by now.
Absolutely.
So how comes Polish is your native language?
So I was born in the United States to a couple who were born in Poland. So both my parents were born in Poland. I have a Polish birth certificate. So the Polish government considers me a Polish citizen born in the United States. And I grew up when I was very young with my parents, with my grandparents in the U.S. speaking Polish because my family had only come over to the U.S. a few years before I was born, and they were much more comfortable speaking Polish at home. And it wasn't until, a couple years in preschool, kindergarten, that it just became easier for me to switch into English through my daily life.
Yeah, and then what happened? Were you speaking Polish less?
Yes. Yeah. So Polish is really my heritage language. I saying it's a native language is true, but really it's something I've inherited. And typically, when somebody has a heritage language and they're living in a society or an area where the majority population does not speak their heritage language, usually by age 5 or 6, when that person starts going to school, they start really just using the dominant language. They start learning more vocabulary outside of the house in the dominant language. They start playing with other children in the dominant language. And slowly but surely, their heritage language slips off, specifically in reading and writing, if they ever knew how to do that. And then speaking becomes much harder than listening, which is why we're speaking in English.
And you have a very good knowledge about the theory behind it. So was it any research in that?
Yeah. So I first came into this word, heritage language, when I started learning Spanish. So I began learning Spanish, I think it was like 2016 or 2017, around there. It was something that I'd always wanted to do. Living in the U.S., I have a lot of Spanish-speaking friends, and I came into this term heritage language, and the first time I saw it written down, I just cried. Like I sobbed because I had always throughout my life carried a lot of shame. Like I have a Polish passport. I have a Polish birth certificate. I really have that as a huge part of my internal identity as well. And it was really a secret why I could understand people, but I couldn't speak it. I couldn't read it. I couldn't write it. And when I came into this term heritage language, there had been a lot of research that had been done since about the year 2000, 2001. That came out after I had, mostly lost my ability with Polish. So I wouldn't have had access to that at a younger age. But it was an absolute miracle And there's more and more and more work going into why heritage languages exist, the internal shame or the external embarrassment when you have to interact in your heritage language, as well as how to help heritage language users. Since on one hand, we are not native speakers, in that if I was thrown into let's say like a business conference in Polish, I wouldn't be able to keep up with native speakers. But on the other hand, I am a native speaker because I don't need the rules explained to me in the same way. I can kind of sound it out and I know which way sounds better. So there's an increasing amount of research done now. And actually in the United States, more and more school systems are adopting heritage language programs when there is a large enough population to support that, which is really, really exciting. And I hope is a trend that we continue to see.
That is so interesting, really. And I do agree that it's very important to have, to conduct research in that. And it's super interesting. Were you thinking about going into now? Like, I just thought, maybe that could be your academic career.
Well, you know what? It's funny. If anybody had previously followed me on Instagram years ago, I was heading it in that direction. And my original and my current career is in event planning, marketing, graphic design. And I just fell in love with heritage languages. And I actually spent, it would have been the school semester from 2021 to 2022, working in public schools in my state in a heritage language program for Spanish speakers, which is interesting as a non-heritage Spanish user, but as a heritage Polish user. And actually with kids in my Spanish classes outside of the heritage population that were heritage Polish speakers, it was really, really cool. It was a very cool experience. But it was sort of what led me to decide to not pursue that. There's a lot going on in education in the US right now, and I didn't feel like it was what I was called to. But I am extraordinarily passionate, I think, about helping heritage language users who are adults reclaim sort of their language in a way that we couldn't have when we were younger because the research didn't exist.
It's super fascinating. During COVID, when obviously events were not happening and you had more time, yes. You were doing this whole project. You had a website, Relearn a Language, and a YouTube channel, and you were kind of doing a lot within that. Yeah, tell me more about that.
My career, like I said, is in events management. And so I was actually shut down for a little over a year in COVID. And initially we thought it was, of course, if everybody remembers, going to be very short, ended up being a very long time. And I decided to take a year to see what I could do with Polish. And for me, I'm pretty type A. I'm very organized. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I should look into heritage languages. I should learn the best reading strategies. I should learn the best listening skills. Like I should really read the literature and then see what I can do. So it ended up being a couple of months of research before I started Polish. And then I spent 12 months seeing how far I could get using that research that academics and people primarily in universities had done. And the website is still up. Everything is still up. There's a lot of resources. It's relearnalanguage.com. And I had such a blast with it until events started happening again. And as far as the research that I myself did, I did very little. I mostly saw during that year my place as a person who had a lived experience that they were willing to share. And with that lived experience, my goal was to popularize the understandings of heritage language research and the experiences of heritage language users within the language learning community. Because when I had stumbled into this phrase, there really wasn't any discussion on popular podcasts and social media, in some of the polyglot conferences. I hadn't heard anybody use it in the couple of years between when I first came into it and when I started relearning Polish. And I spent a year really just making content about the research, going on podcasts and discussing the research, and trying to popularize it to the best of my ability, while also, I wouldn't ask anybody to do something that I wouldn't do. So while at the same time, I was also creating videos about my own work. Relearning my own process. I was creating a lot of Instagram content about the sort of wins and losses, and was trying to sort of lead by example during that time. And it was a really great project. I worked on it for a year, which was the goal. And in that year, if anybody wants to watch on YouTube, I answer a series of questions day 0 in Polish, and then I answer a series of questions day 365. And obviously there's still a lot of problems, but I think the first video I must have come out with maybe 5 or 6 words in Polish, and then by the end I could cobble them together. And I was really proud of that, and especially working through how emotionally difficult the process was, I think was really valuable to other people as the feedback that I got. And yeah.
Yeah, well, I can imagine, because like you said at the beginning that there was some feeling of shame that, person with a Polish passport, why can't I be fluent Polish speaker? And it's, I guess, different. I don't know. I'm Polish and I grew up in Poland, so I completely don't have this experience. I have another experience of living in England and forever having a foreign accent. And that's also a different thing. But yeah, it's very, I guess it must be different emotionally for you to relearn Polish than, for example, to learn Spanish or some other language. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for my example, I'll speak from my personal experience, but there are many others. For my lived experience as an American who was living mostly in Mexico, but throughout Latin America while they were learning Spanish, I was, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that I'm white, I was allowed infinite mistakes. Any amount of Spanish that I put out of my mouth was, wow, like you're speaking Spanish. Like the bar was low. People were nice. And so for me, Spanish did and still does just feel like playtime. Like if I mess up, nobody cares. And I have sort of the freedom that kids do when they are acquiring a language to mess up. And that's not true. I know that's not true for people that learn Spanish or any language in a school system, but learning through immersion to me is just playtime. Whereas with Polish, I never felt that. I was a lot of internally was and still is, why am I not better? Why don't I know this word? I had, I'm sure, some well-meaning tutors who after were like, wait a minute, your last name is Polish. Well, why don't you do this? Well, why can't you do this? And it's like, girl, if I knew, why would I be paying you? So there was a lot of woulding and shoulding and canting. And it was internally a very hard experience that is very common. And I wish there was more discussion about that, although that is certainly changing now from where it was 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, I'm sure it's changing, but I still feel that, it's changing within the community, like language learning community, which is very more aware. But I guess it will take time before it goes down to general population.
Yeah. And it will, I mean, I'm forever optimistic that there are, teenagers and young adults now who are graduating from these very new heritage language programs in a variety of languages. And I am forever hoping that they will take those experiences and normalize them because they were normal to them. And the program that I worked in, it was a public school that was primarily Black and Latino, and not all of the Latino kids could go into the heritage program. So we had to even have conversations with certain kids with, okay, this is your heritage language, and you're going to go into the population of kids that have no contact with Spanish just because of where you're at. And other kids, well, okay, you're going to go into the heritage program, but don't compare yourselves to these other people. There's a lot of conversations happening within these programs. So I'm still optimistic that within, 10 years or so, when the generation of kids in these programs grows up, that there will be some public knowledge. But I do think it's going to take a long time.
Mm. And it's also probably changes because I'm thinking now about my friends who their kids were born in France. They lived in many countries. They speak few languages. They are not kids anymore, young people. But when this girl was born, I kind of remember that her mom was told in France that she shouldn't be teaching her Polish because she will get confused. And, and as a parent, you kind of think, well, I want the best for my child. So do you know what's the advice sort of now about that?
Yeah, there's a lot. I would hesitate to say there's one type of advice right now or back then, but I think that in the 20th century and before that, that was the advice is, oh, your kids will get confused. They can't do that. And we now know that that's simply not true. And that children who grow up bilingual end up with more proficient language skills. They end up with more proficient problem solving. There may be lags in their early linguistical development, usually around age 3 or 4, they sort of surface. By 6 or 7, you might find little just differences between them and monolingual children, but those differences quickly even out and become an advantage. So whether or not that's the advice that parents are given, I don't really know, but that is not the advice that many public schools, many language teachers, many language centers are giving out anymore, because we know that has been proven incorrect. But even with that, I think that there's a certain instinct to say the cause is the parents. I think there's a certain level of blame on parents. And the reality is that parents, especially immigrant parents, although not all heritage language users are immigrants, but especially immigrant parents, are working jobs. Many of them are working multiple jobs, and it's not realistic to have them give their kids a language education. Where I'm from, there's a very large Polish population, and it's pretty common for Polish kids to go to a Saturday language school, but that's not always true based on the population. And there's also not a lot of research to show that those Saturday schools are even effective. A lot of the times, I think now in the 21st century, it's simply something that is not able to be prioritized, even if the parents don't want it. But there's also a third and worse possibility. So not just that the parents were told no, not that the parents couldn't do it, but in North America, we have a really horrific tradition of residential schools for Native American children who were forcibly taken away from their family and their language and forced to learn English, or in some cases French, forced to learn colonial languages, despite what the parents could do and tried to prioritize. So I would caution anybody from sort of looking at the parents or the individual family and saying, okay, have we socially prioritized this? Do we have the funding? Do we have the space? Do we have the support for parents? And is the sort of education we're doing with these kids based on heritage language research and based on their unique relationship with the language? Or is this based on a monolingual academic model of how a foreign language could be taught? And heritage languages certainly are not foreign to those of us who use them.
I now want to know more about that.
It's really cool. Yeah.
And tell me about your Polish. What do you find most difficult in Polish?
Yes. So with my Polish, I still find, producing the language the most difficult. So speaking, I still struggle. Writing is incredibly hard. And that's pretty common for a heritage language user. For me, understanding it often is very simple. And even reading it, because Polish is so phonetic, reading it isn't very hard. So right now, at this sort of season of my life, the majority of the contact I have with Polish is watching movies. I follow a lot of Polish meme accounts, so reading Polish. I would say that's sort of where I'm at, is still the eternal heritage language struggle of production, of avoidance. I still, despite knowing all of this, nobody should feel bad if they find themselves avoiding their heritage language, because I still do that. There's a large Polish population where I live. And if I have to go, to the Walmart and my cashier's chatting with Polish and the person in front of me, it's hard to get myself to want to practice, even though, I quote unquote should, even though I could take advantage of that. That shame, still sticks with people, I think, for a long time. And it's not abnormal. And they're certainly not alone in feeling that. And there's also a weird, and I'm saying this mostly for the benefit of listeners who are in my shoes, and I'm going to shed light on this now that I'm out of COVID. Because, of course, my first year of learning Polish, I was in a very safe space. I was in my apartment online with language learners. And now that I'm back in my diaspora Polish community, there's a secret rivalry between people who are my age, who are born in Poland and grew up here, and people here who were born here and grew up here, even if we're all citizens, even if we all speak Polish, even if we all have American accents. And so I have had, that's a new layer of heritage language that I've had to navigate, is being questioned by people who are Polish of, well, where were you born? Who is your family is a big one, because we all know each other. Well, do you have your passport? There's like a certain level of interrogation. And that's something that I've have a lot of Puerto Rican friends, and that's something that they've also gotten that I was not aware of from other Puerto Ricans, was, well, nitpicking your language skills. Well, where were you born? Well, who is your family? And it becomes very, like you said, kind of an interrogation. And I wasn't prepared for that. Leaving COVID with my brand new, shiny, kind of basically B1 Polish, like I was not ready for the strange interactions in Target I was about to start having. So I still am working on my bravery. I'm still working on my shame. I'm still working on it. And I think it's going to be a lifelong process, but that is part of my story. That is part of who I am. I am just as American as I am Polish. And if somebody has problems with that, that's their own internal stuff that they're putting on me. So I gotta not let them worry about me. So
absolutely. If they have a problem, it's their problem.
There are, and different communities have their own challenges as well. One that I face as a Polish American that is specific to me is people, there's one really big Polish church in a city near where I live. And I will constantly get asked, what church do I go to? Why isn't it that church? Who do I know? Like, it's very, very centered around that. And again, I'll use the example of one of my best friends is from Ghana, and her brother, also born in Ghana, grew up here and cannot really speak the several languages that her family speaks. And he is constantly grilled by other Ghanaians as to why that's not possible, because I think I get a little bit of a pass because I'm white on people are kind of like, oh, okay, like white girl from Connecticut, like you're really American. He's kind of othered from his Americanness, which is, well, you're not really American, you're from Ghana. And I think, race and particular populations and particular traditions and beliefs will sort of impact how people interact with you in these very strange ways, depending on where your heritage language is. But yeah, it's strange, and it's something that I wish I had known earlier on in my heritage language journey. But of course I couldn't have, because it was COVID and I was in a bubble.
But yeah, it's quite amazing how the communities themselves put it on, people who should be, should, again, maybe not should, but we kind of think, well, shouldn't we all be more understanding of each other, especially challenges we face, the similar challenges, and yet, the rivalries is, I guess, is there as well. And that is true that Polish communities very often gather around churches, Catholic churches, usually, Polish churches.
Again, my Ghanaian friend, who is a remarkable human, a lot of her cultural identity in the US is also in the Pentecostal church, because that's sort of their gathering place. Yeah. And a large part of her identity as a Pentecostal Christian is because she is Ghanaian. I cannot imagine she would ever go to a non-Ghanaian church. Whereas with me, I grew up Catholic, obviously. I'm no longer Catholic. I will only go to church from dragged. And that is
weddings and funerals.
Weddings and funerals. I'm trying to skip the weddings too, mostly funerals. But if I have to go, I will. And that's another layer of being, sort of the intersection of being an immigrant and using a heritage language and being American, where no Americans aren't going to churches very often anymore. So I have that sort of on me. But it just kind of creates a very unique sort of chopped salad combination identity life that can feel very confusing and shameful, but it's really, really very, very normal. And so if there are other Polish heritage users who are struggling with that, it's just because everybody else is hiding it. Is the real secret. Everyone else is hiding their shame. And the cool thing about shame is that if you come out and you claim it, you don't feel bad anymore because everybody else says, yes, me too.
Oh, that sounds like a very, very good piece of advice. I was going to ask you, what could you, because I know I know from the stats of the podcast that there's a lot of listeners in America. Yes. And in general, in the countries where, apart from Poland, where I guess, there are foreigners who move to Poland and they live in Poland and learn Polish. But otherwise, there are people from those countries where traditionally there was a lot of immigration. Yes. From Poland, so like UK, US, Canada, France, Germany. So I guess quite a lot of people who listen are people who are probably heritage speakers or relearners of Polish, apart from those who learn because they have Polish partners. That's another big group of people.
Sure.
Like my partner. And they usually give up very early.
No, stick with it. It's totally worth it. It's so hard, but it's worth it.
Yeah, I think it is. I think, and also it's very, like, if someone has no connection to Polish, though, like no family, no history, right, and they speak Polish, is just always so impressive to all Polish people. Like, why are you even doing this? It's so cool. So that's, I think I was going to ask you for a piece of advice, but I think that was a very good one for.
Yes, I will double down on that and say that, if you are feeling any sort of a difficult internal emotion, so shame, guilt, imposter syndrome, if you find yourself putting yourself down or saying, I should be doing this, why can't I do this? Please seek out heritage language information, heritage language resources, because it can feel so lonely. But there really is there are more and more people. There's a larger and larger community online of people who are talking about this. And even if those people aren't Polish heritage users, they might be, touching on another language, or your story could sound very different than mine. It could have been your grandparents or your great-grandparents who spoke Polish, and you want to reclaim that part of your genetic or cultural lineage where you have had no contact with Polish personally. There are so many other people going through it, and speaking to it, meeting those people, finding those resources, and really leaning into those bad feelings and paying attention to them, I think will get you a lot farther than trying to ignore them or push through them, truly.
Thank you very much. So we'll finish on that. And it was fantastic. It was so great to have you.
Yes, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. I was thrilled to be asked.
Mam nadzieję, że słuchało Ci się Marissy równie przyjemnie, jak mnie się z nią rozmawiało. Koniecznie zajrzyj na stronę relearnalanguage.com i na kanał Marissy na YouTubie. Linki znajdziesz w opisie odcinka. A ja zapraszam Cię również do zapisania się do mojego newslettera, w którym dzielę się ciekawostkami o polskim języku i kulturze, polecam filmy, seriale i książki, przypominam o nowych odcinkach podcastu i od czasu do czasu daję znać, jak można się ze mną uczyć polskiego. Link do zapisu znajdziesz na mojej stronie polishstories.net i w opisie odcinka. Nie jestem zbyt aktywna w social mediach, więc newsletter jest najlepszym sposobem, by być ze mną w kontakcie. W następnym odcinku moją gościnią będzie Róża, Polka z Kanady. Do usłyszenia.